Connor Hellebuyck is no longer interested in staying with the Winnipeg Jets, and Tom Wilson could be on the move from the East Coast to the West Coast in Los Angeles, and the Stanley Cup Finals seem to be drawing to a close. But who amongst the Vegas Golden Knights players should be the winner of the Conn Smythe Trophy? All of this and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi and hello, hockey fans. Welcome back to the Locked On NHL podcast, Western Conference Tuesdays, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Dane Lewis, host of Locked On Dallas Stars, and joining me as always on Tuesdays, Seth Toupal of Locked On Minnesota Wild. Seth, how's it going?
Not too bad. We are starting to get a little clearer picture as to how this Cup Final is going to play out, as the Vegas Golden Knights are on the doorstep of taking home the trophy. And so we're getting closer to the true offseason that everybody has been in for a few months. And so getting closer to those final couple of games of actual hockey before we dive into fully off-season topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Potentially the final game of the NHL season tonight on Tuesday as the series goes back to Vegas, and the Golden Knights looking to win on home ice for their first Stanley Cup in franchise history, although it's hard to count out the Florida Panthers after what they did against the Boston Bruins, but certainly a very big uphill battle for the Panthers if they want to pull off the comeback and do one more miracle. But the Vegas Golden Knights, a very difficult team that is playing some good hockey right now. We'll talk about that team later on in the show. Of course, plenty of other drama to discuss around the Western Conference. But before we jump in, I do want to say thank you for tuning in and making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform of choice. We're always free and available, no matter where or how you choose to listen. And Seth, we'll go ahead and start off in the Central Division with a team that you and I are both pretty familiar with in the Winnipeg Jets. And we knew that this offseason wasn't necessarily going to be a fun one for them. Pierre-Luc Dubois, for quite some time now, has expressed interest in playing elsewhere. He's an RFA this offseason, but it seems like he's not going to be returning to the Winnipeg Jets. And you're starting to get to the end of some other contracts. Blake Wheeler going into the final year of his deal. Mark Scheifele also in that same boat. It seems like it's kind of the end of an era for this core of Winnipeg Jets players. But the cherry on top of this Sunday, if you even want to call it that, or whatever the opposite of a cherry on top of a Sunday is, now there's news saying Connor Hellebuyck, a Vezina Trophy winning goalie who has won it in the past and is a finalist for the award this year, is no longer interested in being a member of the Jets long term. Is this shocking news to you? Were you expecting news like this? I mean, Hellebuyck seemed to be maybe arguably the face of the franchise in Winnipeg, and now it seems that he wants out, and it seems like it could have some pretty big implications for the organization going forward and leave them they were already in a pretty less than ideal spot, but now, I mean, this would be detrimental to this organization if Hellebuyck does decide to move on.
I think it is a little bit of a surprise, but I think we have seen just how much all of this magnified after Rick Bowness's comments to end the season, saying essentially that none of the top guys on the team showed up at all in the series. He was extremely discouraged with how they played, and it's a situation where you never want to be called out publicly by your coach. I mean, Rick Bowness is not wrong, to say the least, but since then we've seen Pierre-Luc Dubois even up it a little bit to saying he's not even going to sign a bridge deal. Like, let's just get out of here and get somewhere else. And now Hellebuyck as well. And this is what happens at the end of the long run with the core group of players sometimes, is that you have some successful seasons, but you don't end up getting that ultimate prize, which is the Stanley Cup. And so then you look around the league and you say, I'd like to go try to get this somewhere else. And so this, I think, was always this was always one of the options for Winnipeg, maybe the one that they didn't want. But I think there always was a chance that all of these guys at the end of their deals opted to go somewhere else with a little bit better team structure to try to win that cup. And so now for Winnipeg, it becomes all about trying to maximize what they get in return. For Pierre-Luc Dubois, should be a sizable return for him. He's 24 years old. Yes, he has been traded now from two teams, from Columbus and now here from Winnipeg. So that's a little bit of a concern. And then you got Connor Hellebuyck, who is still one of the best goalies in the NHL. Really had a nice return to form this year after a struggle 2 years ago. So they're going to have a ton of assets on their hands. But as we've seen with teams like Anaheim, Chicago, getting rid of all those guys and pulling in a ton in the way of premium assets in return does not necessarily mean that it makes your climb out of that hole any easier. And so this is going to be a very tricky offseason for Winnipeg to navigate, because you have to deal with not getting enough back in return, because Dubois pretty plainly has stated that he wants to go to Montreal. So you don't have a ton in the way of leverage there. Hellebuck, you don't have a ton of leverage there. Does Mark Scheifele opt now to want to get traded? Blake Wheeler? Like, this could be a very, very busy offseason for the Jets.
And not to mention, or I forgot to mention, Nino Niederreiter also going into the final year of his current deal for $4 million cap hit. Interested to see what could be done with him, because I know he kind of got bounced around over the past few months with, going from Carolina to Nashville and now Nashville to Winnipeg. And if all these other players start to leave, a guy like Niederreiter, who's 30 years old, I guess technically in some ways still in the prime of his career, but you'd have to imagine he wants to be in a winning environment. Given that he was, in Carolina, where they're consistently competing for the playoffs. Nashville, I think, had a little bit higher aspirations in the preseason. Now, not so much, but I'm curious to see what happens with him as well. But staying specifically on Connor Hellebuyck, the cap hit for him comes in just a little over $6 million, $6.1 million. Where can you anticipate him going? Do you think there's any teams out west that would be interested in his services? Because there's plenty of teams that need goaltending, but to go out and get a guy like Connor Hellebuyck, I feel like you're having to say, hey, we're missing, the only piece missing from our team is a goalie, and then we're set to maybe go compete for a Stanley Cup. Because, I mean, you could plug him into an Anaheim or an Arizona or San Jose, but then he's your best player and you don't really have the pieces around him. So do you see any contenders out west that would be interested in Hellebuyck's services, or do you think there's a chance that he maybe heads out east?
I would think east would probably be the front runner. I have a friend who hosts a Minnesota Wild-based podcast here in Minnesota, who is a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, and that's interesting. You've got that core group who, if the Penguins don't decide to take a step back, maybe try to go with Hellebuyck on a shorter term to try to maximize the window that guys like Sidney Crosby are seeing start to close a little bit. So that's intriguing to me. As far as Western Conference teams, I mean, the Los Angeles Kings and the Edmonton Oilers are two teams that it seems like are always a goalie away, especially in the kind of downside of Jonathan Quick's career. The Kings did get Jonas Korpisalo in hopes that he could solidify the goalie room, but we've both seen, Dane, you need two goalies to get you to where you want to get to, which is the Cup final. You need two guys to ride at different times, whether it be in the regular season, whether it be in the postseason. And so do the Kings get involved in Connor Hellebuyck? That would be intriguing. I mean, Edmonton is just going to roll the dice on goalies every season until they finally hit on two. So they maybe would. And then, the other interesting one, I think, just because it's Toronto, does Toronto get involved?
Yeah, I think all of those teams super intriguing. LA was kind of where I was leaning, where you look at this team that has made the playoffs over the past few years and, just been unable to get over that first round hump. In the past 2 years, it's been to Edmonton, who I guess they maybe don't necessarily have the advantage in net. It's more they have Connor McDavid and the LA Kings don't. But
Right.
you add a Connor Hellebuyck to that core that they have in Los Angeles. And that's a dangerous team. Kopitar going into his final season or final season of his contract, maybe his final season at age 35. But Kevin Fiala, they've had him locked up for several years now. Philip Deneau. This is just such a good team, and Edmonton is as well. But I almost feel like they're more inclined to stick with Stuart Skinner, given just what they got from him this season, being a Calder Trophy finalist. That you would imagine that they have trust in him, but maybe you find a way to make the 1-2 punch of Hellebuyck and Stuart Skinner work, and that's a pretty deadly duo. Although I don't know what Jack Campbell's contract looks like, but I know they just got him last offseason, so that could be a tricky situation. But very interested to see where Connor Hellebuyck ends up. And the Winnipeg Jets, it's a little bit of a mess at the moment. And I feel like that was maybe to be expected with this organization, but we're just going to have to see how everything plays out, where everyone ends up going. And like you mentioned, if they can get a decent amount of return in terms of draft picks and prospects, it might end up working out okay. And they might not have to go into a full on deep rebuild like we've seen Anaheim, San Jose, and Arizona have to go through. And maybe the Jets can be back near the top sooner rather than later. But from one team out west to another, plenty of rumors to go around in terms of who's going to be on the trading block this offseason. And Tom Wilson of the Washington Capitals has been rumored and linked to the team we were just talking about a second ago on the Los Angeles Kings. And Seth and I will dive into those rumors coming up next. But first, we need to tell you about today's sponsor, our friends over at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit, and it's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can make sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know if the part will fit, or you'll get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are fully guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. I want to thank you again for making Locked On NHL your first listen every single day. Dane Lewis, Seth Toupal with you here on Western Conference Tuesdays. And we've talked about the Winnipeg Jets, but now we're going to talk about another rumor that's been circling around in the National Hockey League news cycle. And Seth actually pointed this out to me before we recorded. Our colleague Dan Holme over at Locked On Washington Capitals, reporting on some rumors that he picked up from Sammy Silver of the Hockey News, saying that there's some interest from the Los Angeles Kings in Tom Wilson of the Washington Capitals, a team that missed out on the postseason. And Wilson, with some health issues over the past year or so, injured in last year's postseason, comes back in the middle of this most recent season, 29 years old, and a key piece for this Washington Capitals franchise. But we're talking about the Kings and them looking to get over that playoff hump and looking to add the depth to that roster. Seth, what is your take on this rumor? Because it seems like the Kings are pretty interested in making this happen. We haven't seen much other than the tires being kicked here, but it seems like it would be a pretty nice add and a pretty big addition for the Kings.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we see teams a lot of times they build their franchise up to try to get some speed, get some skill, and it's a Kings team who their average age, I believe, is right around 28 years old. Kings have a ton of speed, they have a ton of skill, and so then you start to add pieces around that with some of that grit and some of that physicality. And actually, I went and looked at the numbers for the Kings in the hits department. I'm surprised they had 5 players that had over 100 hits on the season, and so they've still got some guys that are capable of throwing their body weight around to try to kind of establish presence and to go along those lines. But you're bringing in a guy potentially in Tom Wilson who's more like a 200 to 250 hit per year player. He's an agitator. He's a guy that is able to kind of get under the skin of some of the top players of your opponents. And look at who the Kings have to go up against as some of those top level guys in the Western Conference. You've got Connor McDavid. You've got Nathan McKinnon. You've got a ton of top level talent. Kirill Kaprizov, another guy that goes up against, and of course, Jason Robertson as well. So you've got a ton of top level talent. And for a Kings team that would be trying to add a little bit of postseason experience, Tom Wilson checks that box as well. And, he's not a slouch offensively either. He had 24 goals last year, had 13 in 33 games this season. He's 28. And so if you're looking to add a little toughness to the mix for what ended up kind of letting them down in the postseason, it's not a bad route to go if the price is right. That's going to be the key, is if the price is right, if it's not too big of a pull to try to get Tom Wilson to head over to Los Angeles. I would say if I'm the Kings, I say go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like the Capitals are kind of in this weird spot where they're not ready to go full on rebuild, but they could look to sell some pieces and get some assets back in return to, potentially gear up for the next few seasons of trying to win with Alex Ovechkin still on the roster as he continues to age. And it certainly could happen. The Kings, $7.3 million in current cap space, and Tom Wilson's current contract that he's under with 1 year remaining, the cap hit coming in at $5.1 million. So you certainly could make it happen as is, but again, the price would have to be right for the Kings, for them to send either prospects or picks back to the Washington Capitals. But that's where things get interesting, because they don't have a first round draft pick, the Kings, in this year's draft. They only have one pick in the third round that isn't their own, and not a ton of capital spread throughout the next few years. And that could really put them in a bad spot. They do have a first round pick in 2024, but if you trade that pick away for Tom Wilson, then you don't have a first round pick in back-to-back drafts. And who knows if that comes back to haunt the Los Angeles Kings down the road. But I mean, you mentioned it and you hit it right on the head that this is a guy who can play both sides of the ice pretty well. I mean, he's the agitator. He can get under the best players on the opposition team's skin, but can also, chip in offensively. 15 points in 21 playoff games in the 2018 postseason when the Washington Capitals won the Stanley Cup. I mean, he scored 5 goals in that postseason. So if you can get that from a player who that's not his main objective, but that's more just kind of the sprinkles on top of the cupcake, I think that you'd have to be pretty happy with that. And especially in the playoffs, as physical as those series get, especially, we saw the hatred come to a boil against the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, you add a Tom Wilson into that series to, go at a Draisaitl or McDavid. And I mean, that could change the dynamic of the series.
Yeah, most definitely. And for the Kings to make this work, this is then where you see GMs, okay, we don't have a lot of picks to deal with. And so that's where you then go into your prospect pool, and it's not going to be one of your top guys, but maybe that class that's a little lower, a guy who I don't want to say have soured on, but are just not sure if they're going to be able to reach that kind of impact level, but are young enough to where they're an intriguing prospect for a team to take a flyer on, as opposed to just losing a impending free agent for nothing. I would imagine that'd be the route that the Kings would go, is it'd be a prospect that they throw to Washington to try to make this work.
Yeah, I can see that as well. And it's going to be an interesting storyline to follow as the Kings are looking to bolster that roster and take that next step in the Pacific Division. Because I feel like now that Vegas is on the doorstep of winning a Stanley Cup and Edmonton still has 2 of the best players on the planet, that Los Angeles is still going to get overlooked in some aspects. And, of course, you now have Seattle on the rise, and Calgary is going to be looking to get back to their winning ways here this season. They're going to have to do everything that they can to keep up with these other teams. And I think the addition of a Tom Wilson would be a huge step in that direction. And it would probably eliminate any possibility of Connor Hellebuyck coming out there, but you could get by with Korpisalo if you re-sign him. And you do have Phoenix Copley for the next season as well under contract. And if you can somehow just make that work, Elite goaltending is a must in the postseason, but we've seen some teams have some success with less than ideal goaltending, even in this most recent playoffs. But we'll just have to see what the Kings look to do in order to stay relevant in the Pacific Division with plenty of other good teams, including the Vegas Golden Knights, who are on the doorstep of winning their first Stanley Cup Tuesday night at home against the Florida Panthers. And coming up here in just a second, Seth and I will talk about who should win the MVP award, the Conn Smythe Trophy, if the Golden Knights find themselves victorious. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On NHL. Thank you again for tuning in and making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. And the potential final game of the NHL season is upon us. Game 5 of the Stanley Cup Finals. The Florida Panthers have done all they can, it seems, but the Vegas Golden Knights just seemingly overwhelming them at every turn. And the Panthers were able to get a win at home in overtime, but unable to secure the win in Game 4 to even the series. And now Vegas with the chance to clinch at home. And Seth, just initially before we jump into Conn Smythe talk, do you think that the Vegas Golden Knights finish off this series, or do you think that we maybe go back to Florida one more time?
Oh, that's a good question. I want selfishly to see Florida give it kind of one last gasp to try to keep this series going, but ultimately I think Vegas just has the formula that they're going to be able to use to ride this series out for one more win. They've gotten really, really good goaltending from Adin Hill. They've got extremely timely scoring from their top guys, Jack Eichel, Mark Stone, Jonathan Marchessault has hit another gear seemingly, and defensively they are stifling defensively in front of the net. And I think it's been a great run for the Panthers. It's been so much fun to watch them just steamroll through everybody through the Eastern Conference playoffs into the Cup final. But ultimately, I think Vegas gets it done. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Panthers win, kind of absolute backs against the wall, desperation win. But this is a Vegas team that is very good at adjusting. And so even if the Panthers do pick up a win to push this one to a Game 6, I think the Golden Knights have it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, especially being in a similar situation with the team I cover in the last series in the Western Conference Final. The Stars win 2 games in a row and they start to build some hope. And that's my fear for Panthers fans, is they come out and win this Game 5 and then they get excited for one final game at home. And that's kind of where Stars fans are at. They were so excited for Game 6 only to get beat 6-0. And that's how your season ends. And it stung in the Western Conference Final. And I can only imagine it would sting much worse to lose in the Stanley Cup Final and then watch, the opposing team lift the cup in your building. So, that, Vegas fans would love for the Knights to take care of business at home, to be able to hoist the trophy in T-Mobile Arena after the Washington Capitals got to do it a few years back. Just talking about Tom Wilson, one of the guys who got to lift the cup in Vegas a few summers ago. But there's an interesting discussion to be had, and you touched through a lot of these guys that are listed as odds-on favorites to win the Conn Smythe Trophy. And it's an interesting debate because this isn't a Vegas team where it's been one player who's taken over. It's been by committee, and that's what makes them such a good team, is they just squeeze the life out of these opposing teams and have won a lot of these series in 5 games. And it seems like they're on the verge of doing that again because of the good goaltending, the good defense, but also it's not just one guy taking over offensively. Jonathan Marchessault is the current favorite, according to FanDuel, at -600 to win the Conn Smythe. Adin Hill at +1,200. Then Matthew Tkachuk at +1,800 and Jack Eichel at +2,200, which is interesting to me to see Eichel below Tkachuk. But again, if the Panthers are going to come back and win, it's probably because Tkachuk goes ballistic, and then he would definitely deserve and earn that award. But let's just say the Vegas Golden Knights win the championship. They win the Stanley Cup on Tuesday night. Who do you think deserves the Conn Smythe Trophy and why?
The more I look at this, it just seems, and I'm gonna take the non-trendy pick here and go with the favorite. I'm gonna go with Jonathan Marchessault. Jack Eichel has been playing the facilitator role incredibly well for the Golden Knights throughout this series, throughout the postseason as well. We've seen it from Mark Stone a little bit as well. But the fact that Marchessault has 4 goals in this series, when it's the biggest stage, the Cup Final, the biggest stage you have in the NHL. The fact that he has 4 goals and he has also managed 7 points in these 4 games, he's making an incredible impact. And it's not like he's shooting a ton either. He's being incredibly opportunistic. He has 3 power play goals in this span as well. And so I'm going to go with Marchessault. But if I had to pick someone else that was not the favorite, then I'm going to do the next, in terms of pecking order, the next least trendy pick and go with Adin Hill. Because, I mean, you look at some of his performances in this this series against the team in the Panthers that has just been so good in this postseason. He has held them to 2 goals or fewer in 3 of the 4 games. The one game he did give up 3 goals was the Panthers winning in overtime 3-2. He has been really good in this postseason, but also, as you talked about, and I think the reason that he probably won't get it is just that there have been so many guys that have been scoring. And for a Golden Knights team that's scoring 4 or 5 goals a night, your goalie doesn't have to be razor sharp perfect. Hill has been great. He hasn't had to be razor sharp perfect like Sergei Bobrovsky was for the Panthers against Carolina, for instance. So I'm going to go with Marchessault. I think he just seems like he's been getting better as the playoffs have progressed. But if it's Eichel, if it's Stone, if it's Adin Hill, I'm not going to be surprised at all, because it really has been a team effort that has been able to get them to this point.
Yeah, and I think I'm there with you. If I had to pick a skater, I think it would be Marchessault. He was just all over the Dallas Stars in that Western Conference Final, and has just continued to catch fire as the Stanley Cup Final has gone on. And I feel like for Adin Hill, I almost want to make the case for him to win it, just because he's been so lights out. And I feel like one of the knocks against him could be he hasn't played the whole postseason. He didn't play in that series against Winnipeg because Laurent Brossoit was still healthy, but I feel like that shouldn't be held against him, just because that's not his fault. He couldn't control that, and he probably would have done just as well, if not better, than Brossoit in that series. And he has 2 shutouts during the playoffs. Or yeah, they were both against the Dallas Stars. Like, the Stars were consistently a top 10, even at times top 5 offense this year. I mean, it wasn't that the Stars were lacking offensive punch in that series. I mean, Jason Robertson, Rope Hintz, Joe Pavelski, Sagan, Ben. I mean, all of those guys were playing in those games that they get shut out. I guess Ben wasn't playing for some of that first shutout game, game 3, but he played the first few minutes of that game. But I mean, that's impressive to shut them out, not just once, but then to do it in an elimination game in Dallas. I mean, you look at those performances, and then, this Panthers team who's been just on fire, lighting up the Bruins, the Leafs, and the Hurricanes. Those were, I think, collectively the 3 favorites to potentially win the East and maybe win the whole thing. I mean, that's what everyone kept saying, is it's really just a matter of who's going to make it out East. And then whoever wins the West is just going to have to settle for runner up. And the Panthers were able to take down all those juggernaut teams. And now here they are on the brink of elimination. So I think Adin Hill deserves a ton more credit. And of course, the odds on FanDuel or wherever you look for your odds aren't the end all be all, and the performances in Game 5 could have the final say. But I certainly do think that Adin Hill deserves some recognition. But you ask anyone on that Vegas team, and I doubt they care who wins that award. They just care about bringing the championship to Vegas, and especially Jack Eichel. I mean, that's a huge storyline for his career, getting taken after Connor McDavid and potentially getting to hoist the Stanley Cup before Connor McDavid does.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun too, and I don't know if there's a better spot for a Stanley Cup parade than Las Vegas. I guess we'll find out, assuming that they do hold on to win the series. But it has been just an incredible run for this Golden Knights team to be able to pull it together. We looked back in the season, and they were the top team in the West for a while. Then they started to take on a little water, but credit to Bruce Cassidy for tightening things up. And it's a juggernaut. It's a juggernaut Vegas team, and they absolutely deserve to be the one hoisting the cup when it does happen.
Absolutely. And I know the Vegas fans right now are like, why are you guys acting like they already won? And if there's a jinx, I'm sure people will come back to blame us. But I mean, I just don't see this Vegas team losing 3 in a row. That's just the way I feel, and I'm sure you feel that way as well. They're just too good, too disciplined, too well coached. But should be a fun and entertaining Game 5 with the Panthers, like you said, backs against the wall. They're going to be giving it everything they've got in the Vegas Golden Knights, of course, looking to hoist the trophy in front of a sellout crowd at T-Mobile Arena. And quite possibly the final game is for what has been an incredible and fun 2022-2023 NHL season. But that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On NHL. We want to thank you again for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. If you're interested in anything Dallas Stars related, you can find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis, or just search for the Locked On Stars podcast on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast at. And Seth, if you want to let the people know where they can find you and your work, now is a great time to do that.
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Seth Toups. Also, you can follow Locked On Wilds on social media, on YouTube, your favorite podcast platforms. Just search Locked On Wilds. You'll find everything that we have to offer as we navigate through the offseason, the draft coming up as well. Then it'll be free agency. Before you know it, it will be the preseason, and then we'll be back at it for the 2023-2024 season.
That's right. And the Western Conference could be looking drastically different. Seth and I will be here to cover it all throughout the offseason. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next Tuesday.